Welcome back to The Real with Dr. Silvermoon Cashen, where real conversations, purposeful living, practical wisdom. Good evening, and I'm Dr. Silvermoon Cashen. I rose from poverty, I'm built by resilience, and I'm living with intention. This is episode 3, and tonight we're going to talk about something that quietly shapes your life every single day. The stories you tell yourself, not the stories you tell other people, not the stories you share publicly, the ones you live with privately, the ones that show up when something goes wrong, the ones that whisper when you're tired, the ones that speak up when you're deciding whether to try again. Those stories matter more than most people realize. Because you don't live life as it is. You live life as you interpret it. Two people can experience the exact same situation and walk away with completely different lives. One grows, one withdraws. One keeps going, one stops trying. The difference isn't intelligence. It isn't opportunity. It's the story they told themselves about what happened. Let's slow this down. When something doesn't work out, what is the first sentence that runs through your mind? Not the one you say out loud. The first one. That sentence is powerful because it sets the tone for everything that follows. If the story says, "I'm not good enough," your body contracts. If the story says, "This always happens to me," your motivation drops. If the story says, "I can learn from this," your nervous system stays open. The difference changes outcomes. Most people don't realize this, but the majority of their internal stories were formed early. They were shaped in childhood, in school, in family dynamics, and moments of praise or criticism. They were formed when you were trying to make sense of the world with limited information, with limited power. And those stories were adaptive. They helped you cope, they helped you survive, they helped you belong. But here's the part people miss. A story that helped you survive may not help you thrive. And just because a story feels familiar does not mean it is true. It means it's been repeated. Your brain loves familiar things. Familiar stories feel safe, and even when they're limited. So you keep returning to them automatically. Stories like, "I have to do everything myself. I can't rely on anyone. I have to stay ahead. I'm always behind. I'm too much. I'm not enough." These stories become agreements. You don't consciously sign them, but you live as if they're true. And here's something important. You don't have to blame yourself for the stories you learned, but you do get to choose whether you keep living by them. The choice begins with awareness, not judgment. Awareness sounds like, let's make sense given what I've lived through. That sentence alone creates space because shame locks stories in place. Compassion loosens them. From a faith perspective, this is powerful. Transformation begins with renewing the mind, not denying pain, not ignoring reality, but choosing truth over fear. And even if faith is not your framework, this still applies. Your beliefs shape your behavior. Your behavior shapes your outcomes. If the story says, "I always fail," you stop trying. If the story says, "I can grow," you keep moving. The story doesn't just decide your life, it directs it. Before we move forward, I want you to pause with this. What story do you hear most often when things don't go your way? Not to fix it, just to notice it. Because noticing is the first crack in the old narrative. And once a story is seen, it can be questioned. Stay with me. Quiet stories are always running in the background of your life. Where do these stories come from? Because most of them didn't start with you. They were learned. Some were taught directly. Some were modeled. Some were absorbed without you even realizing it. Let's start with survival stories. A survival story is a belief you form to protect yourself. It might sound like strength. I don't need anyone. I'll handle it. I won't let that happen again. I'll never be that vulnerable. At one point in your life, that story helped you. Maybe you didn't have consistent support. Maybe you were disappointed. Maybe you had to grow up quickly. And your mind did what it was designed to do. It created a narrative that kept you safe. That story wasn't weakness. It was adaptation. But here's the problem. Adaptation that goes unexamined becomes identity. You don't just say, I learned to be independent. You say, this is just who I am. And once something becomes who I am, it's much harder to question. Let me ask you something. Are you strong because it's aligned with who you are? Or because at one time you had no other choice? That distinction matters because some strengths are beautiful and some strengths are armor. Armor protects you, but it also limits connection. Now let's talk about identity stories. These are the stories you tell about who you are. I'm the responsible one. I'm the peacemaker. I'm the overachiever. I'm the quiet one. I'm the emotional one. None of these are inherently bad. But if you feel trapped inside them, they've stopped being identity and started becoming confinement. You are not required to stay the version of yourself that made sense 5 years ago, or 10, or 20. Growth requires updates, but here's where it gets even deeper. Some stories aren't even yours. They're inherited. You may have inherited narratives about money. People like us don't get ahead. You have to struggle to succeed. It's selfish to want more. You may have inherited stories about relationships. Love is hard. Don't trust easily. Keep your guard up. You may have inherited stories about worth. Don't take up too much space. Don't be too loud. Don't be too confident. These narratives often sound normal because you heard them repeatedly, but repetition does not equal truth. It equals conditioning. Let's pause here. Think about the environment you grew up in. What beliefs about success were common? What beliefs about failure? What beliefs about rest? About ambition? About asking for help? Those beliefs shaped you, and you may still be living by them without realizing it. Here's something important. You can honor where you came from without being confined by it. Questioning an inherited story is not betrayal, it's growth. From a faith perspective, this is where renewal matters. Not everything passed down was meant to be carried forever. And even if faith is not your framework, this still applies. You are allowed to re-examine any belief that shapes your life. Let's go deeper into something that feels uncomfortable, something we cling to, which is often old stories because they excuse us from risk. If the story says, I'm not a leader, you don't have to try. If the story says, I'm just not good with money, you don't have to learn. If the story says, I always mess up relationships, You don't have to be vulnerable again. Stories can protect us from pain, but they can also protect you from growth. And here's a question I want you to sit with. What story have I been telling that conveniently keeps me safe, but also keeps me small? And I want you to ask yourself that question. And it's not meant to shame you. It's meant to free you. Because once you see the pattern, you'll have a choice. You can keep the story, or you can begin loosening your agreement with it. Loosening does not mean forcing change. It means questioning gently. It means saying, is this still true for me? Or is this story outdated? You don't need to erase your past. You need to update your interpretation of it. Survival stories once kept you alive. Identity stories once gave you stability. Inherited stories once gave you belonging. But purpose requires freedom, and freedom begins when you realize you are not obligated to live by every story you learned. I want you to take a moment to reflect on this. If you could gently release one story that no longer serves you, which one would it be? You don't have to answer that out loud. Just notice what comes up, because awareness is already change in motion. We're not done. We're going to talk about how to break agreements with old stories without turning against yourself. We've went over identity stories, inherited narratives. Now we need to talk about something that feels even more delicate. How do you break agreements with stories without turning against yourself? Because here's what often happens. Someone hears a conversation like this and thinks, oh, I've been believing something limiting. And instead of compassion, they feel embarrassment or frustration or even shame. That reaction makes sense, but it's not helpful. Shame does not rewrite narratives, it reinforces them. If the old story was, I'm not good enough, and you respond to awareness with, how could I be so stupid? You just created a new layer of the same narrative. Breaking an agreement with an old story requires a different posture. It requires maturity. It requires emotional steadiness. It requires the ability to look at yourself honestly without hostility. Let me say something important. The story you believed was never random. It made sense at the time. It protected you. It helped you navigate something difficult. And that deserves acknowledgement. You don't break an agreement by attacking the story. You break agreement by outgrowing it. There's a difference. Attacking sounds like, that was stupid. Outgrowing sounds like, that made sense then. It doesn't serve me now. Feel the difference? One creates tension. The other creates freedom. Let's talk about agreements for a moment. An agreement is something you decide was true at some point in your life. You may not remember the moment, but somewhere along the way you concluded something. People leave. I have to overperform to be valued. Vulnerability is dangerous. And you started living accordingly. Breaking agreement does not mean denying what happened. It means refusing to let what happened define what is possible now. Here's where it gets real. Sometimes we cling to old narratives because they give us a sense of control. If the story says, I can't trust anymore, then you never have to risk being disappointed. If the story says, I'm not meant for more, then you never have to risk trying. The old story feels safer than the unknown, but safety and growth do not always live in the same space. Let me ask you something carefully. What story are you holding on to because it feels safer than uncertainty. Now remember, you don't have to answer these out loud. Just notice what tightens in your chest. The tightening is information. Here's another layer. Sometimes breaking agreement with a story requires grieving it, because the story may have been part of your identity. If you've always seen yourself as the strong one, what happens when you admit you're tired? If you've always seen yourself as independent, what happens when you admit you want support? Letting go of an old narrative can feel like losing a version of yourself, and loss deserves acknowledgement. From a faith perspective, renewal is not destruction, it's transformation. The old self is not shamed, it's refined. And again, as always, even if faith is not your framework, this still applies. Growth is integration. You don't erase who you were, you expand beyond it. Breaking agreement with an old story happens in stages. First awareness, then questioning, then experimenting with a new belief. You don't jump from I'm always overlooked to I'm completely confident and unstoppable. That leap is too far. Instead, you try something gentler. Maybe I'm more capable than I've allowed myself to believe. That's enough. New stories don't need to be dramatic. They need to be believable. Let's make this practical. If your old story is, I always mess things up, a new story might be, I'm learning. If your old story is, I can't trust anyone, a new story might be, I can learn to choose wisely. Small shifts create large change over time, because once you loosen the agreement, your behavior follows. You take small risks, you speak up slightly sooner, you try again, and each new experience gives you evidence that the old story was incomplete. Here's something powerful to remember. You are not betraying your past by choosing a new narrative. You are honoring your growth. Sit with this question. If I stopped defending the story that has defined me for years, who might I become? Now don't answer it quickly. Let it sit. We're going to talk about new narratives without pretending, without performing, and without losing yourself. We've talked about where stories come from. We've talked about survival narratives, identity labels, and inherited beliefs. We've talked about breaking agreements without shaming yourself. Now the question becomes, how do we live a new story without pretending to be someone you're not? Because this is where many people struggle. They think choosing a new narrative means faking confidence or forcing positivity or denying their history. That's not what it is. Living a new story is not performance. It's alignment. It's not about convincing other people. It's about quietly shifting the way you respond. Let's be honest. The old story will still show up. If you've believed for years I'm not enough, that voice won't disappear overnight. The difference is you'll recognize it, and recognition creates space. When the old story surfaces, you don't fight it aggressively. You notice it. You say, there you are, and then you choose differently. That's maturity. That's growth. Choosing a new story starts small. It starts in moments no one else sees. When you would normally criticize yourself, you pause. When you would normally withdraw, you stay present a little longer. When you would normally assume the worst, you consider another possibility. New narratives are practiced, not announced. You don't declare, I am completely transformed. You quietly say, I'm choosing differently today. From a faith perspective, this is renewal in action, not pretending you never struggled, but allowing truth to reshape your thinking. And if faith is not your framework, the principle still holds. Neuroscience confirms that repeated thoughts strengthen pathways. When you repeatedly choose new interpretations, you are literally rewiring your responses. This takes time. It takes repetition. It takes patience with yourself. But here's something freeing. You don't need a dramatic breakthrough to live differently. You need consistent honesty. Let's make this practical. If your old story says, I'm always overlooked, living a new story might mean speaking up once this week. Not aggressively, just clearly. If your old story says, I'm not capable, living a new story might mean trying something you've avoided. Small risk, small courage, big shift over time. Choosing a new story does not erase your past. It reframes it. You can look back and say, that season shaped me, without saying that season defines me. There is power in that distinction. Now, let's address something deeper. Some people fear that if they change their story, they'll lose connection to the people around them. Because sometimes the narrative is shared. Shared struggle, shared identity, shared limitation. Growth can feel isolating, but here's the truth. Real growth does not isolate you. It refines your relationships. The people aligned with you and with who you're becoming will grow with you. And the ones who resist it were attached to your old story. That can be painful, but it is not betrayal. It is alignment. Let me ask you something. If you fully believed you were capable, how would you move differently? If you fully believed you were worthy, how would you speak differently? If you fully believed you were growing, how would you respond to setbacks? Those questions are not fantasy. They are invitations, and invitations require response. Living a new story means responding consistently. It means not collapsing into the old narrative every time discomfort shows up. It means staying steady even when your doubt speaks loudly. You will not get it perfect. That is not the goal. The goal is alignment. Alignment with truth, alignment with growth, alignment with who you are becoming. And here is the heart of episode 3. You are not your old story. You are the author of the next one, not by force, not by pretending, but by choosing honesty daily. Before we close this episode, I want you to reflect one last time. What is one narrative you are ready to loosen? Not eliminate, loosen. And what small action could reflect a new belief this week? This is how change begins, quietly, intentionally, consistently. If tonight's conversation brought clarity that matters, clarity often invites conversation, and you don't have to process this alone. If you'd like to connect with me, you can visit me at www.drsilvermooncashen.com. Remember, doctor is DR, not completely spelled out, or www.drsilvermooncashen.biz. You can email Dr. Cashen at drsilvermooncashen.com. You can text 772-777-8868. You can call 833-LAUNCH-U, LAUNCH, and the letter U, or 855-422-7436. Remember, everything I do is rooted in the same mission. I am an anointed warrior, innovative healthcare, empowered mindsets, intelligent technology, and health integrity. And as we close episode 3, remember this: the story you repeat becomes the life you live. Choose it with awareness. I'm Dr. Silvermoon Cashen. I rose from poverty, I'm built by resilience, and I'm living with intention. And join me every Wednesday at 8 p.m. right here on the DoD network for The Real with Dr. Silvermoon Cashen. Next time, we'll talk about growth without burning yourself out. Until then, stay aware, stay honest, and keep choosing stories that move you forward. Before we completely end tonight, there is one thing I want to leave with you. Just one more layer. Because sometimes the most important part of a conversation is the quiet moment after it. You've just spent time thinking about the stories you tell yourself, and that can feel heavy, not overwhelming, but revealing. So I want to ask you something gently. What if the story you've been carrying was never meant to be permanent? What if it was simply a chapter, not your whole book, a chapter? We often live as though the version of ourselves we develop during hard seasons is the final version, but it's not. It was a survival version, a coping version, a getting through version. And those versions deserve respect, but they don't get to define your future. Sometimes growth is not about becoming someone new. It's about realizing you were never limited in the first place. You were adapting, and adapting is not weakness, it's intelligence. But here's the shift. You don't have to keep adapting to environments that no longer exist. You don't have to keep bracing for pain that is no longer happening. You don't have to keep proving yourself in rooms where you already belong. That's where story shifts begin. Not with force, not with hype, with awareness. And awareness is powerful. So tonight, as you turn this off, don't try to rewrite your whole life. Don't try to fix every belief. Don't try to overhaul everything at once. Just notice. Notice what felt true. Notice what felt uncomfortable. Notice what felt freeing. Because the part that felt freeing, that's alignment. And alignment is quiet confidence. Not loud, not dramatic, steady. You are allowed to evolve beyond the stories that once protected you. You are allowed to question the narratives that kept you small. You are allowed to become more honest, more aligned, more whole. Not because you're broken, but because you're growing. And growth is not loud, it's intentional. So take your time, be patient with yourself. And remember, you are not your old narrative. You are the author of the next one. Let it be written with awareness. Let it be written with courage. Let it be written with intention. And when you're ready to go deeper, I will be here. Because being present and having someone who's accountable with you always makes things easier. So remember, be gentle with yourself. Just start to pay attention. We're not reshaping, redefining, inventing the wheel. We are just noticing where we are starting to align. See you next week.